All right, guys, so wanted to run you all through my firewall, my 55 two-door hardtop project. I did a lot of, custom work to it. It's still an original firewall. It's not one of them aftermarket ones that you can just weld on. This is an original, but I tried to clean it up a little bit. Basically, cheaper to clean up what you have than it is to buy an aftermarket one and put it all in there. So this is pretty much what I did. Now, right off the bat, I painted my car black. So the problem is on these cars, the firewall is body color, which is black. So when you do a black car, there's a lot of things that have to be black. So it's hard to get detail in black. So what I do is paint different shades of black, like satins and semi-gloss and that type of stuff. That way the different colors of blacks actually look like you had the car apart and painted each piece separate, which is what I wanted. I had a lot of people, arguing that I needed to paint my chassis gloss black, and I don't like painting my chassis gloss black. I never have, even if the car was a different color. I like a flat or a satin finish, but I like to do gloss black accessories like I did my A-arms and spindles and all that. But it really broke it up and gave it some detail. But anyway, I used a solid steel bar in the firewall right here, and I welded it top and bottom all the way around. I ended up having to cut it and sharpen the ends to a point, and what that did was made it look like a bead rolled panel at that point. But I had to break it off here because the factory hood hinge comes down lower, so I had to break it off, and then I stopped it right here on both sides. It doesn't continue down the toe board, but I sharpened this part to a point as well. But this flange right here that is usually full of seam sealer on one side, I ended up going through in there and welding all this up solid, and then I used a burr bit and went in there and kind of radiused a little bit to mold it in, but it just turned out a lot cleaner. Now, with this bead rolled look in here, this is what it would look like without the steel bar in there. It is two separate panels when this is put together from the factory, and this part here is actually higher than this part. So they basically take this old brush-on seam sealer and they just slime it in there. Now, I've chipped out a lot of it, and some of it has fallen out through the years, but anyway, over here, I've chipped more of it out, but you can see it's basically just glopped crap in there, and this is what happens is you get a little rust started in behind it. But anyway, I'm going to end up chipping all this out of the four-door and then going back in and blasting this channel real good and then epoxy prime that and then put two-part seam sealer back in there. But when I do it with seam sealer, I'm going to go in here with tape and, leave a little bit out, like maybe a 1/8 inch on the other side of each of it, and basically seam seal it and then pull the tape off. So it'll look like a nice straight row of seam sealer. And I'm going to use that self-leveling two-part seam sealer that goes in this style gun right here. And that way, it dries pretty hard, but you can actually shape it if you need to. So anyway, so I did the bead rolled panel and I love it. I think it looks pretty nice and nobody's going to really notice that. So the other thing I did that was quite a bit of work, I mean not really, but I changed all of the studs in my factory heater box and my brake pedal assembly over there where it comes through the firewall. You have steel studs. Now the factory heater box has really, really long studs hanging out of it. And they also like to take your skin off of your arms if you're up in here working on your car sometimes. But anyway, I took and removed the studs from the factory heater box and the brake pedal assembly, and I replaced it with stainless steel bolts and welded them in. So now I have all stainless hardware, but I went with shorter so it looked a little better. My whole theme on the car was 12-point ARPs, bolts and stuff. So if I would have went with a regular hex head ARPs, I would have did acorn nuts on all these. I think acorn nuts would look really clean, especially on the brake master cylinder stuff. But, I did 12-point ARP, so I had to use nuts. I wish they made 12-point acorn nuts. That would really be trick ARP if you're listening. Anyway, so I changed the studs out on the master cylinder as well. Now, these cars originally have 4 studs, and I had to remove the top 2 completely because these later master cylinders, they just have 2. But to me, having all stainless hardware just is another one of them details, and it really wasn't that hard to do. But anyway, the other thing I did was, now I'm running the factory original deluxe heater assembly in this car. Don't plan on doing air conditioning, but I'm probably going to want to later, but for now I like to keep it simple and clean. So anyway, I used my factory heater box stuff in here and all new parts. But anyway, when you get a new blower motor, like this is a reproduction from Danchuk, if you put it in here, The one thing that's different is the wiring. The wiring on this blower motor is actually external out here, so the wires come out, you know, further out to the end of the motor. So they need to go back into the car. So I ended up drilling a hole and putting a rubber grommet on it. I put a little bit of that weave loom on there to give it a little detail. But anyway, you probably could just stuff that up against the motor or run it down in there, but keep in mind that is a rolled edge of steel right there, and it could over time, you know, wear through and get into the wire. So that's why I did that. But anyway, the heater core, if you buy a heater seal kit, reproduction, there'll be these little round foam donuts in there, and you're supposed to put them, after your box is assembled, you put them over your heater core ports, push them up against the box, and then you put your heater box into the car. And it basically seals your firewall to your heater box, which I have those on there. But out here, it doesn't look so great. So what I did was I took a rubber grommet and I cut it in half, and I slid them on over that, and then used the heater hose and just pushed it on there real tight, and it basically tension set them up there on the firewall. But it give it a little detail. So anyway, I kind of like it. It looks a little bit more finished. But the other thing I did, I have a low-car flexible transmission dipstick, which is undone right now because if you've been following along, I got to pull my engine and stuff out. But anyway, I built a bracket here on the firewall and molded it in. It's all out of sheet metal. It's kind of got a little curvy shape to it where it flows in. But anyway, I did it there because I can hide that flexible dipstick. Being as it's black, it'll go in behind, kind of like behind the valve cover, so it's not out here. You know, normally you'll see them screwed onto the firewall right here. I did it at an angle because this part is angled on the firewall, but the other thing about it is if you're standing out here and you want to check your transmission fluid, I want to stay off of the fender with my body so I don't scratch the paint. So I did it at an angle so I can pull it to me instead of, you know, reaching over and pulling up. But anyway, just me. It's the way I did it. Now I've got these body mount brackets here. They're welded on from the factory. They actually come up way further. I cut them down, which people's been doing this for years. I've done it several times myself, but I've never made a cover to go on there. Normally guys just plate these in and weld them all up. I'm assuming they weld a nut in here or a nut cage or something in here, I don't know, to attach your hardware. What I wanted to do was be able, if I ever had to take the body off the frame, I wanted a removable cover, so I built it out of fairly thick sheet metal. It's just pretty much one-sided, but when the inner fender's in this car, it kind of curves in like this, so you really don't see, you won't see back in here, but you will see that side. So that's why I only did one side. But you know, I made it all out of flat pieces. I used a hole saw and used pipe caps, and I stepped them large to small. Gives it, you know, like speed hole look. But I got a rubber grommet in there, and that's for my main battery cable to pass through. And anyway, these will go on here and bolt on. I still have to color sand and buff these, that's why I haven't attached them yet, but they'll go on down there. Now I've got my original attaching hardware for my inner fender that bolts on there, and I've actually notched that cover out with an oval hole and everything, just like it would be. So anyway, and I've got this rubber welting here that will go on the edge of this, and that'll keep it from scratching, chipping, rattling, you know, whatever on the firewall. But anyway, that's how I did my body mount covers for the front here. So anyway, moving on over here, I went with a, you know, an original style electric wiper motor that still works, and I welded up the big hole in the firewall right here for a big grommet, and it's drilled my own little hole, a little tiny grommet just for that cable. Now the power wire coming out of that wiper motor is going straight back into the firewall, and I've got a male and female spade crimped onto the wires with a rubber grommet. It's a pretty large grommet with a small hole in the center, and it's behind it, so it's hidden. So if I ever pull the wiper motor, I can pull that, pull the grommet out, and then undo the spade and pull the motor off. But it's a lot cleaner that way. And that's, if you've noticed, my wiper motor has different colors. Like this main body's flat black, and then the cap and this little plate cover's gloss black. If you've ever looked at an original wiper motor, they have two different shades of silver. It's like a cad plating and then some other color. It's probably just raw pot metal, but anyway, so that's why I broke it up in two different shades of black to give it detail. But I also changed out all the hardware in this motor to stainless steel Allen buttons that I polished on the polishing wheel. And then I put a new slide on it, because them old slides are always yellow looking. You know, they fade out and look like crap. But anyway, I used 12-point ARPs and all the attaching hardware up there holding the motor on and everything. That was kind of the theme of the car, is 12-point ARPs. If you have ever bought a package of 12-point ARPs, like a 5-pack, On average, they're about 15 bucks. And it just depends on, the bigger you go, the more they are. So I have 12-point ARPs and everything, but you got to keep in mind, I've started this project in 2013. I've built and sold a lot of cars in between to pay for this project. So when I would get a paycheck at one time when I was working at a place, I would spend, 100, 150, 200 bucks on bolts. And then I'd get my next paycheck and I'd spend more money on bolts. So I have a ton of money in bolts and ARPs, but to me, hardware in a custom car is a big statement. You got to have that hardware for detail, basically. Anyway, so on this side of the firewall, I just smoothed everything up, welded everything up. But over here, you'll notice I have a rubber convoluted tube here. Now, I did this several years back on a 56 Chevy that I ended up selling. And I had lots of people ask what that this wiring deal come off of, and honestly, I couldn't tell you. What I do is I go to my local pull-apart salvage and I'll walk the aisles until I find a door laying on the ground, and then I'll just remove this. On newer cars, this actually goes into your cowl and goes to your door, and it's for your power window wires, speaker wires and all that to go through. But anyway, I hole sawed a hole in the firewall and set that end in, and then this end goes into the inner fender right here. I hole sawed a hole in it, so that other piece goes in here. Now, if you'll see these studs welded to the back side of these inner fenders, that wiring will come out and go into these rubber lined loom clamps here, and they will bolt on. So the wiring will be completely hidden, because originally the headlight wire harness and a lot of that other stuff just goes right across the inner fender on the inside, so you'll see all of that wiring harness. This way it hides it, because the way that curves around right here, you're only going to see about this much of that. But to me, I think it's cleaner looking. Now, this other one is my speedometer cable. This is an aftermarket Pioneer rubber coated or plastic shield, or whatever you want to call it, speedometer cable. Now, I did have to do a pretty funky grommet on it. It's got a small hole, but it's got a large diameter for the smaller end to go to the speedometer. But anyway, so that ended up doing this side. Now, one thing I had to do on this deal here it's kind of a mess. When I got this, I didn't realize, see how wide that slot is for that to go into something? When you just hole saw sheet metal, look how thin that is. So when I done it to the firewall, I had a lot of slack. So I ended up taking a piece of wire hanger, like your clothes are on from the dry cleaners, and I bent it around a piece of round tubing the same diameter, and then I cut it down and I welded it all in there and then bevel ground it. So it basically looks like stamped in there, but it took up the slack. Now on this one, I didn't do it to the inner fender. I actually ended up finding a rubber O-ring that's kind of thin, but it's that same diameter, it fits on there. So that actually worked to take up the slack in that. If you did want to do that and you wound up that way, you could probably find rubber grommets, at just about any hardware store, and you might find one to take up the slack in there as well. So anyway, that's how I did my hidden wiring. Now, when you get up here, you've got wires that have to go across the core support. Normally, they are attached by clips right here that slip onto this, and your wiring, you can see it. What I ended up doing was I hole sawed a hole in the inner fender right here, and I can use the original rubber grommets that you can buy from Dan Chuck for all your, your baffles and all that. So your factory rubber will go right in there, but your wires can pass through that and go right underneath the core support out of sight. Now, I welded 1/4x20 bolts underneath this core support down up in there under the tube to take them same kind of clamps to hold that wiring up there. So a lot of work, but a big end result. The firewall pad, to attach it to the firewall, normally you put your firewall pad in these cars right here. They're attached by these clips that go through the firewall. Now, if you're using your original steel ones, or you can get them reproduction, they remind me of shark teeth. When you got a brand new painted firewall and you go to attach those, they normally flake the crap out of your paint around that hole, and you're going to see it. So I ended up welding 1/4x20 bolts everywhere that a clip went, and that way you can lay your firewall pad up on them studs and then use acorn nuts and washers to attach it. So here's how I done it. I took a 1/4x20 bolt, and I grind the head smooth and clean, get all the CAD plating off, and I draw a little bitty Sharpie mark right there with a Sharpie, and I'll stick it up there to a hole like that and get that, line that hole up in the middle, and then weld it up. And then you know your bolt's in the middle, and then you grind it smooth, and you've got a smooth firewall with a stud on the back for attaching your firewall pad and stuff. But 55 had steel clips, 56 and 7 took plastic, but you still have this clip thing protruding out of the firewall. It just looks like crap, which on a black car, you're really not going to see them. But anyway, there is acorn nuts and washers right there, so you can see how everything attaches. I've got a wiring mess under here, but anyway, I've got a acorn nut with that custom washer right there with all the little indent holes in it. Those are actually from my Ring Brothers hood adjustment bumpers. I tried to install these with those on the base, and it's actually a nut, but the hood, it actually holds the hood up too high. They're too tall. So I ended up using a really thin stainless steel nut down here, and I used those washers down there just for looks. You know, I've got 2 of those nuts left over, so that's what I used them for, was the bottom ends on both sides. So, you know, in case somebody gets down and bends down here, you can see those. But I think it's kind of cool. Just me. I'm biased. It's my car, you know what I mean? What else? So my windshield washer motor and everything, you got to have the hose to go to your windshield wipers. I ended up drilling a hole in the side of the cowl up here and put a rubber grommet on it so the hose will actually pass through. It will go up in this stuff as well, so it'll be hidden. But anyway, when you put your fender and your inner fender in, you're not going to see any of this because the fender actually comes across right here. So you won't see this at all. But anyway, I have the hose going up through there into the cowl into a plastic T, or a Y basically, and then one going there and another piece will go over there. But anyway, guys, that's pretty much the firewall. And man, oh man, I didn't realize how much work it was until I started looking at everything, and then you start talking about it. It's like, man, that was lots and lots of work. But these old firewalls, there is hope for them. You just got to put the time in if you don't want to buy the aftermarket one that kind of fills everything in. You know, I wanted to run my original throttle linkage stuff and all that stuff, so I didn't want to alter too much of it. But I haven't decided fully on what I'm going to do with this 4-doors firewall. I do want to clean it up a little bit, but I just don't know if I want to put in that much effort. This one will probably get re-seam sealed, but I'll do a little bit cleaner job on the seam sealer. But anyway, that is my firewall, my 55 2-door hardtop. Thanks for watching.